How did a once pleasant fishing village on the shores of Lake Michigan and Milwaukee turn into smokestacks, freight cars, and the largest wastewater treatment plant in Wisconsin? It might be odd to think about, but what you're staring at right now is hundreds of years of human history, from Native Americans all the way to an immigrant group from the north-central area of Poland called the Kaszubes. Today, when you travel underneath the Hohn Bridge in Milwaukee toward a small peninsula leading out into Lake Michigan, you will see a sewage treatment plant, hills of road salt, freight cars, plus a tug called the GL Ostrander that tugs a concrete barge named the Integrity. But this place wasn't always smokestacks, salt piles, storage, and sewage. Before white settlers came to Milwaukee, Jones Island was a marshy strip of land that several different Native American tribes would gather at every summer for its tremendous access to fish, wildlife, and wild rice. There were not only the fish in Lake Michigan and the three rivers that flow through Milwaukee, but beavers, ducks, geese, muskrats, elk, deer, black bears, raccoons, and foxes. Several of these animals were also key to the fur trade that was so important to the Great Lakes region at the time and was the source of bartering between Native Americans and European settlers, as fur hats were all the rage in Europe. The Potawatomi also had a village at the river mouth. A French missionary wrote of it in 1679. At its height, at least 500 indigenous people lived in this village. In the 1700s, after French missionaries wrote of the land, French Canadians built trading posts on modern-day Jones Island as the fur trade began to boom, with the shores of Great Lakes harboring an abundance of beaver. And the Native Americans would trade with these French Canadians. These French Canadians would bring sickness with them, mainly smallpox, and this ravaged the Potawatomi community. The French Canadians also brought alcohol with them, which greatly affected the Native Americans. By the 1830s, the Trail of Tears of course happened, and Native Americans were getting removed from the North too. As I discussed in my Dark History of Mission Point on Mackinac Island video, tribes from all across the Great Lakes were either moved west or cornered onto reservations as Anglo-Americans created unfair treaties with the looming threat of extermination. This was the case for the Jones Island Potawatomi in 1838, when they were forced to move onto reservations in Kansas. When the Erie Canal was created and the Great Lakes were open to much more shipping travel, more and more people from the East Coast and eventually European settlers were making homes around the Great Lakes. Although Wisconsin was not granted statehood in the 1830s like Michigan, it was still appealing to many new settlers, including a young shipbuilder by the name of James Monroe Jones. By 1848, the exact same year that Wisconsin was granted statehood on May 29th, a shipbuilder by the name of James Monroe Jones came to Milwaukee on a ship called the Lowell. Jones was born in 1824 on farmland in Ohio. Jones would eventually go to Cleveland where he learned the art of shipbuilding, and he'd take this carpentry talent to the new bustling city of Milwaukee and would start a shipyard near the Milwaukee River before moving on to the west side of the peninsula that is now known as Jones Island. Jones Island would be a major shipyard in Milwaukee in the 1850s, building at least 24 ships in that time, hence why the peninsula was named after him. James Monroe Jones was no novice shipbuilder. Many said his ships were the fastest on the Great Lakes, mostly building three-masted schooners as well as some propeller-driven steamships, including the Allegheny. The Allegheny has a very interesting tale that coincides with James Jones. It was actually first built by Luther Moses in Cleveland, Ohio in 1849. She was a propeller ship, and according to the Buffalo Courier in 1849, she measured 460 tons and was the largest vessel of her kind on the Great Lakes. In 1850, the Allegheny was carrying 159 Norwegian immigrants from Buffalo to Milwaukee. Allegedly, there was a typhoid fever outbreak on board, and according to a Weekly Wisconsin article in 1850, 54 people passed on the voyage and were thrown overboard, and the rest were quarantined at an old government building at the mouth of the harbor, seemingly on Jones Island. According to the History MKE podcast, many more passed away in quarantine and they were buried on Jones Island. Just 5 years later, the Allegheny ran into more trouble when she was again sailing to Milwaukee on October 21, 1855, this time headed by a Captain Curtis with a large amount of cargo. There was a severe storm that morning with heavy gales that blew away the ship's smoke pipe and disabled the steam on the ship, leaving them drifting with the waves. Captain Curtis attempted to drop the anchors of the Allegheny, but they failed to hold. As the ship drifted for an hour getting closer to Milwaukee's harbor, it hit the bottom of Lake Michigan and water started pouring overboard. Passengers were then brought into the upper cabin and they started tossing cargo overboard, attempting to make a bridge from the boat to the shore. There were 30 passengers in all, and luckily all were saved and gotten to shore, but most of the passengers' luggage was lost. The ship was then left in Lake Michigan and much of it broke apart from the fierce waves. And according to the History MKE podcast, when people attempted to drag parts of the Allegheny out of the water, they uncovered human bones that came out of the dirt. Although I can't find any proof of this in the newspapers. And there's one more tie-in to our story here. James Jones and his shipyard would then save the boiler and the engine of the Allegheny, and would build a new Allegheny for the American Transportation Company the next year in 1856. Parts of the old ship are still at the bottom of Lake Michigan. Jones Island was only an island for 1 year in its total existence. The peninsula looked much different before 1857, when mariners had to enter the channel next to Jones Island down here, which made them travel upstream. And in 1857, the city actually created a straight cut channel through Jones Island so that ships could get into Milwaukee's three rivers much faster. And in 1858, a massive storm hit the Great Lakes region and blew a hole in the island with part of the land washing away. And this storm would uncover even more bones, but this time it was Native American bones, most likely from the Potawatomi that lived there. It also uncovered pots and pipes that were taken by settlers. Another storm would then fill these channels with sand and make Jones Island a peninsula once again. And around the same time, there was the financial panic of 1857, after the New York branch of the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company went insolvent due to bad investments, and agricultural exports from the United States to Europe not being needed as much when the Crimean War came to a conclusion in 1856. These bad investments and decline in agricultural exports, along with the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company going insolvent, resulted in 1,400 state banks and 5,000 more businesses going under, and the United States delving deep into a recession. James Jones would then cease shipbuilding on Jones Island in 1857 as the financial panic hit and his credit dried up, before the aforementioned massive storm on the Great Lakes in 1858 caused tumult around Milwaukee, with many buildings and fishing posts being destroyed, and Jones Island being flooded for 2 days, including James Jones's once bustling shipyard. And with this, James Jones finally said, "Screw it, I'm going to the stove city of Detroit, Michigan," leaving in 1861. Around 1100 years ago, a Slavic tribe came to the Baltic Peninsula of northern Poland, with some settling on a smaller peninsula called the Hel Peninsula that separates the Bay of Puck and the Baltic Sea. And these people were called the Kaszubes, for the specific dialect of Polish they spoke, while some say that Kaszube is a language in itself. These people were quite good at fishing and could withstand the cold winters in the modern-day north-central Poland region. They were also known for their pottery and embroidery. Poland was constantly colonized from the late 1700s onward, mostly between Russia, Prussia, and Austria, with part of it also being in Germany after the unification of Germany. The Kaszube region was mainly colonized by East Prussia after the several partitions of Poland in the late 1700s. And by January of 1863, the Polish people in Warsaw, with a growing sense of nationalism, became sick of Russian rule and would often protest in Warsaw. Multiple times, Russian forces would open fire on these protesters and unalive them. With the Polish nationalism movement growing, Russia thought a good answer to this unrest would be a forced 20-year conscription in the Russian army, and this obviously only angered the Poles, which led to the Polish uprising of 1863 and the, quote, longest-lasting insurgency of partitioned Poland, unquote. The insurgency was mostly guerrilla warfare against Russian officers by Polish people that were being forced to join the Russian army, but higher-ranking people within Polish society eventually joined, although there was not much foreign enthusiasm for this rebellion. It was an extremely bloody year for the Poles, with many public executions staged in an attempt to quell the uprising, along with thousands of guerrilla warriors deported to Siberia. The Kaszubes were not involved in this struggle, but they would have known about it. And after this year, Tsar Alexander II of Russia abolished serfdom in Poland. The Kaszube region of Poland was under East Prussian rule and was subject to the unification of Germany from August 1866 to January of 1871. Under this unification, the teaching of the Polish language was outlawed, so many young Kaszubes were forced to learn German. Catholics were persecuted, and there was mandatory conscription into the German army. Meanwhile, the United States had just gotten out of a civil war, but there was growing prosperity and factory work in the northern parts of the United States, which created ample opportunities for immigrants, including in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Naturally, as people often do in tough times, they migrate for hope of a better life. And some of the Kaszubes, being from the Hel Peninsula in modern-day Poland, found a much smaller peninsula to settle at, and that was Jones Island in Milwaukee. One man named Jacob Muja came here, and per this PBS documentary, quote, according to local legend, Muja arrived in 1872, took one look at Jones Island, and said, "Fish!" unquote. Muja informally bought a shanty from Yankees that would hunt game and fish on Jones Island, then went back to the Kaszube region of Poland, telling his community about the little peninsula in Milwaukee that was not too dissimilar from the Hel Peninsula in modern-day Poland. And this spread the word to the Kaszubes. There were other immigrant groups that moved to Jones Island at the time too, such as the Irish and the Pomeranians, amongst others, but the Kaszubes were by far the largest demographic. Many Kaszubes were not factory workers and rather had backgrounds in fishing and farming, and so when many of them first started coming to Milwaukee in the 1870s, they acquired smaller sailboats and rowboats and would fish with nets out on Lake Michigan. They quickly realized there was business to be had by fishing on Lake Michigan and upgraded their small boats into motorized commercial fishing boats. When they upgraded to these commercial fishing boats, it was said that they'd catch about 2 million pounds of fish a year, mostly perch, trout, and whitefish. A lot of these fishermen had specific fishing hotspots that they'd leave fishing nets in overnight, and the next day, around 7 a.m., they'd find these nets with a compass and check them for fish, sometimes venturing up to 50 miles away from shore. They'd then put new nets in place of the old nets, and they'd set them before gutting the fish and harvesting the meat. Rinse and repeat, day after day, sometimes putting nets in different places if the fishing captain felt a new spot would be advantageous. After this long day, the fishermen would bring their haul back to Jones Island, where some of the women would then haul the fish meat on carts into Milwaukee to sell it, either smoked, fresh, or salted. And when the winter came, the men would often take factory jobs near Jones Island to make money. In 1880, there were about 20 houses on the peninsula, and as the Gilded Age continued, more and more people began moving to the United States at the end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th century. Jones Island's settler population eventually grew to around 1,600 people, with about 200 houses on the peninsula. Many of the houses looked like fishing shanties and industrial housing, where livestock was aplenty. Some even had horses in their backyard. At one point, there were 11 saloons on the peninsula for the townsfolk to come back and drink after a long day on the lake or in the city. One of the bars was called Cannibal's Rendezvous, and if you drank too much at Cannibal's Rendezvous, someone would throw you onto a rowboat and you'd be rowed back into Milwaukee and kicked out of Jones Island for the night. There were bakers, butchers, a grocery store, smokehouses, and storage sheds. And since many of the Kaszubes were Catholic and went to nearby St. Stanislaus Catholic Church, they wouldn't eat meat on Fridays, so they'd have large Friday night fish fries. It was a full-on community, even though there weren't technically streets but rather dirt roads for people to wagon around on. Their main street was Grand Avenue, which was satirizing another street in Milwaukee that a bunch of millionaires lived on. And because Jones Island was quite swampy, many of the lots that these people built their houses on were makeshift lots where people transported ash, gravel, or sand as the base to build their house on. Due to the informal nature of the dirt roads on Jones Island, the community became a maze that was easy to get lost in. The Kaszubes still celebrated many customs from the old world, such as the pottery and embroidery, but also their rowdy 3-day wedding celebrations with scores of people dancing to polka music, along with extravagant feasts where it seemed like the whole village was celebrating. According to historians, the most popular toast at these weddings were, quote, "May you catch many fish to make your purse heavy, and have many children to make the purse light," unquote. But it would seem that amidst this community growing, these people didn't attain one thing, and that was deeds to the land that they settled on. They were technically squatters, and for 40 plus years, the city did not do anything about these people squatting on the land and paying no property taxes. The city wasn't exactly happy about it, but they also weren't doing anything about it. And that may be because the city could build whatever they want on or around Jones Island, and the residents of Jones Island couldn't legally say anything about it. And this was the case for the 1878 Coast Guard station that was built there, and the 1886 sewage pumping station near Jones Island that pumped raw sewage out into Lake Michigan, poisoning fertile fishing ground for the Kaszubes with poop water. Then in 1902, a garbage incinerator was built on Jones Island, casting bad smells over the Jones Island residents. And since the residents paid no property tax, Jones Island didn't have any electricity or running water or plumbing, and there were no schools on the island until 1896. Before then, the children would go to Catholic school at the same Catholic church many of the Kaszubes attended, St. Stanislaus. The one company that really didn't like this fishing community in Milwaukee was Illinois Steel, who owned an iron mill south of Jones Island and had bought up much of the land left on the peninsula in the 1890s. When deputies showed up to attempt to evict the Kaszubes, a woman wielding clubs amongst 500 others essentially told the coppers, "You could take this land over my dead body," and the police left. Illinois Steel then started to sue the residents of Jones Island. And since these people had no deeds to the property they built their houses on, Illinois Steel had a case. This company even sued the city of Milwaukee because there was a school built on what was technically Illinois Steel property that Illinois Steel had been paying property taxes on. But the Kaszubes lawyered up, and these lawyers figured out squatters' rights, or the law of adverse possession. Or in other words, if you've been living on land for 20 plus years, it doesn't matter if you haven't been paying property taxes on the land. It legally becomes your land. This law was formalized by the Homestead Act in 1862 when westward expansion made many Western settlers' homes into U.S. territory. And instead of the U.S. kicking all these people off the land, they instead said, if you improve the land a little bit, such as built a house on it, then you have a claim to the property that your house was built on. And after years of legal battles, the residents of Jones Island beat Illinois Steel in court in nearly 90% of the cases. But sadly, even with their victories in court, the Kaszubes were again confronted with another battle, but this time by the city of Milwaukee when the city started a bond drive to purchase the land for a sewage treatment plant, with Milwaukee growing rapidly at the turn of the century. And in 1914, Jones Island was condemned by the city, and the people of Jones Island received compensation to move off the peninsula. It didn't help that since the Jones Island residents weren't paying property taxes, they still weren't getting plumbing or electricity, with a garbage incinerator nearby. 300 families were living there in 1914, and 10 years later, it was only 8 families. And in 1925, the sewage treatment plant would be built, a sewage treatment plant that was the largest plant in the world at that time to use a specific technology that would make fertilizer out of wastewater, a fertilizer branded Milorganite that is still around today. The last man to live on the island was a guy by the name of Felix Struck, who owned a saloon called the Old Harbor. But sadly, Struck was evicted in November of 1943 for what the police said was port security. According to legend, the Struck family was the first Kaszube family to settle on the peninsula, and Felix was the first child to be born on Jones Island. He was even nicknamed the unofficial mayor of Jones Island. And Struck would be the last person to move out of the once bustling fishing community. He would then pass away 5 months later on May 23, 1944. But the memories he shared would live on through family members and friends. In 1974, this park that you see above me, Kashube's Park, was established to commemorate the once lively fishing community. It is technically the smallest park in Milwaukee at 0.15 acres. And most say that this park is exactly where the mayor of Jones Island, Felix Struck, had his saloon and lived. It is quite small with only a few branches, a few trees, a Jones Island plaque, and a boat anchor. So if you stand in this park on Car Ferry Drive today, you'll be standing exactly where Felix Struck slung beers to a wonderful immigrant community on the shores of Lake Michigan. In 1977, descendants of the community began gathering at the park once a year for a picnic, a tradition they still celebrate today.